Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the future of travel behavior in Southern Maine. We will be discussing some of the key trends to focus on, as well as uncertainties around those trends that will influence how we get around 30 years from now. And just think, 30 years ago, most people still used landlines and rotary phones. Today, many people can't imagine going a day without their phones in their pockets, which is also their camera, sound system, video game system, main internet device. What might the future hold for transportation? My name is Price Armstrong, and I'm a senior planner at AECOM. I have over a decade of experience as a transportation planner specializing in demographic and policy analysis. I worked most recently at the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority in Springfield, Massachusetts as the manager of planning, and before that worked in the public and nonprofit sectors. I especially like thinking about how to handle uncertainty in long-range planning, so this presentation will be a lot of fun. Let's start by getting a sense of where we stand today. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 2017, most people drove to work by themselves, over 3/4 of commuters. This is true both nationwide and for Southern Maine. Coming in a distant second place is carpooling. We can see that a somewhat higher share of people in Portland worked from home or walked, and a smaller share took transit. In general, though, travel behaviors in Southern Maine are reflective of those at the national level. Today, we're going to look at 3 key trends that we expect to impact how people get around. The first is changing demographics. Next, we'll look at the national policy environment. And finally, we'll take a look at changing technology. I should note that we have another presentation in this series dedicated to new and emerging technology, so I won't dive too deeply into that. The first big shift that we expect to see is what some experts are calling the silver tsunami. This is the aging of the baby boomers, those born between the years of 1946 and 1964, a generational cohort that comprises over 70 million Americans. As you can see in the table, Maine's population of seniors is expected to grow by 37% between 2016 and 2026, while at the same time, the working age population, 20 to 64 years of age, is projected to decrease by 6%. This could impact travel behavior in a number of ways. The biggest is that the vast majority, more than 75%, of older adults live in suburban, exurban, or rural areas. Furthermore, most baby boomers plan to age in place, which for most people means aging in auto-oriented, transit-poor places. However, by age 75, only 69% of people continue driving. What does that mean for our transportation system when we have millions of people living in areas built around the car, but who can't use a car to get around? Many people turn to paratransit, also called demand response, to help with essential trips like grocery runs, doctor appointments, pharmacy, etc., once they're no longer able to drive. Paratransit is door-to-door service, typically run using wheelchair-accessible vans that transit agencies operate for those unable to use conventional fixed-route service. However, we can see in this chart that on a per-trip basis, demand response, here labeled DR, is almost 10 times more expensive than conventional fixed-route bus, here labeled MB. Or, as an article in Governing Magazine put it, a transit agency could move 65 rail customers for the cost of one paratransit trip. How will transit agencies handle the increased demand in hard-to-serve suburban and rural places for paratransit service in the future? On the other end of the demographic spectrum, millennials, the kids of baby boomers, are expected to have changing travel behaviors as well. As a report that came out of the Transit Cooperative Research Program noted, many millennials are starting families and moving from transit-rich urban areas into auto-dependent suburbs. While in the past, transit has benefited in terms of ridership from this very large generation using its service, this is probably going to change. Based on this demographic change, how can transportation agencies meet new mobility demands of its customers? Next, I want to focus on changes in the policy environment. One big unknown in the future is climate change policy. The International Panel on Climate Change released a report in 2018 noting that dramatic decreases in greenhouse gas emissions are needed, 45% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050, in order to hold off the worst impacts of climate change. Meanwhile, transportation is the #1 contributor of greenhouse gases in America. At the same time, almost 90% of personal vehicles in America are conventional internal combustion engines. How might policies change over the next 30 years to reduce carbon emissions, and what impact might that have on travel behavior? Will people buy more low and no emissions vehicles, or walk, bike, and use transit more? How should transportation agencies prepare for those changes? There's also potential for a lot of change in federal fiscal policy. Today, the federal government plays a major role in capital funding. However, as the Congressional Budget Office notes, investment in discretionary federal spending, which includes transportation, is projected to decrease over the next decade. Tax policy experts like William Gale note that current and projected levels of national debt, at highs not seen since World War II, will act as a headwind for any non-mandatory federal spending in the future. If the federal government pulls back as a major funder of transportation, how might Southern Maine direct its transportation funding? How can a potentially smaller funding pie still meet travel demands and local and state policy goals? Finally, I want to touch on some new and emerging technologies. As I noted, there's another presentation that really gets into the weeds on this topic. It's really informative, and I hope you check it out. But briefly, some of the new technologies include autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, which could be networked or connected to allow them to talk to each other. Imagine a travel network that notices too much congestion on one corridor and automatically redirects some cars to another corridor to minimize travel delay. Pictured here is the Google self-driving car. Mobility as a service is another interesting development, where companies can turn all transportation, cars, Uber, Lyft, transit, bike share, into a subscription service instead of the personal ownership model that we currently have. Micromobility is another emerging service, especially dockless systems where you can drop shared bikes off anywhere, not just where there are bike share stations. E-scooters have recently made a splash in many larger cities. So we've looked at a lot of uncertainty, from demographic to policy to technology trends that could impact how we get around in 30 years. How will we respond to changing travel demand as baby boomers and millennials age? How will we accommodate travel demand with a smaller federal role? And how will technology impact travel behavior? Thanks so much for listening today. I really hope that this presentation has helped you think in a new way about the future of transportation and how we're going to get around.